product killer. I'll take it. Hi, everybody. Actually, let's talk about killing products. Why don't we? Killing, it sounds ruthless, aggressive, soulless, maybe, but I would actually say it is the most generous and kindest thing you can do for not only your teams, but your product, your users, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Before we get going, let's actually just take a step back and align on what we do as product managers. In a very simplistic form, we have two jobs. One, we have to build the right thing. That means we have an intrinsic understanding of our user problem, their motivations, their obstacles, the things that keep them up at night that we try to solve. And once we understand that problem, we then put together an elegant, delightful user experience that they enjoy to use. That's the build the thing right part of this. And in the best case scenario, in the most ideal scenario, we do this every day. But let's be real, we don't work in the ideal scenario. In fact, more often than not, it might look something like this. We maybe identified the wrong problem. And if that's the case, we just didn't know the user problem, or we'd maybe architected something different. Or we didn't know the problem at all, and we made up something that was beautiful, but there was no problem. We didn't know the persona who we were after. We didn't know why this was important to the business. Or arguably worst case scenario, and perhaps more often, we didn't know the user problem. We don't know why we built something. In this case, maybe your boss's boss's boss came to you and said, I have this great idea, and you don't want to get fired. So you say, okay, let's take a look, like I did in 2017, where I spent 8 months building 4 different chatbots that did nothing. But, it's actually, if you sat into Itamar's presentation earlier, and he was talking about chatbots, initially there was a moment where they had potential, and I was like, no, it's too much PTSD for me. There was a moment, though, when you do this and you think about why it is important for you to understand the user need, to build the right thing, and in the event that you don't, what happens? Well, luckily you're not alone. Because, we'll just keep going. This is oftentimes where a lot of people sit. There was a group called the Standish Group that did an audit of software development that really thought about how many features are used day to day. And in this case, sorry, my slides. There's an audit that says 20% of all features lead to 80% of engagement. And more perhaps shockingly is 50% of features are no longer used or rarely used. So if you think of that 50%, that means half of your time is on things that will not move the needle. Why do we do that for ourselves? Why do we spend so much time on things that are not going to convert? Well, here's the reason why. Number one, each of these has a valid reason that you need to clock yourself on and make sure you don't do. For example, emotional connection. We are humans. We do think that generally we are on the right track of whatever we're thinking. And we do spend a lot of time and energy and effort in making sure that we make good decisions. And that results in an attachment to whatever our solutions are. Because we spent months poring over these ideas, thinking of every little detail so it aligns to our vision. And then when it goes live and nothing happens, it's gutting. In fact, I used to consult for companies often, and I would go there and I would say, what can we clear off our plate? What's the first thing we can get rid of? And everyone would say, no, it's my baby. Mon petit bébé. No, that is a baby. This is a baby. You go to work to get a salary to bring it home to care for your baby. Your product is for your users. In my case, this is my baby. And I work very hard to take care of him as well. Anyway, emotional connections does not mean that you can't be passionate about what you do. We anticipate that we as product people are passionate, empathetic individuals. But when we do, it does require a certain degree of judiciousness, ways that we can take a step back from our own brilliance and think about decisions that need to be made that are best for the user. Number two, failure is taboo. Because if we have to admit failure, that means we as humans did something wrong, and we don't like being wrong. In fact, we don't like it so much it feels foolish And so we maintain these half-baked ideas for quite some time because if I had to get rid of it, that means I made a decision along the way that was not accurate. But the problem with this is if we don't admit our mistakes, then we carry them with us for the continuous of product development. This is Niklas Zenström. He is a Swedish entrepreneur and more importantly, probably best known for creating Skype. And he has this quote which I think really captures this idea nicely, which is that if we're not failing, we're not learning. We're not acknowledging that there was something that we needed to learn about and that we have to change. And if we're not learning, that means we're not incorporating the best practices into our products. And really, we're living in this fabricated reality where everything we're doing is great. And if everything's great, maybe nothing is great. So you have to be honest about failure. In this case, failure itself is the first step. Once you admit it, you can move on from it. And lastly, our process. So our process is defined to be oriented around the new. Every part of product development, the first thing is what do we need to build, not maybe what do we need to audit. It makes sense when you're writing your roadmap, you want to predict the needs of the future. For your OKRs, you want to incorporate some new build to the business. And plus, it's much more fun to go to a product demo and say, hey, here's something new, versus, hey, I just killed this thing, see you later, bye. You want to show innovation. We are innovators or entrepreneurs. We have the spirit to say, what's new? What's cool? What can we play around in? But your users probably just want something simple, something easy to use. In fact, there was a time I joined a team and I inherited this really archaic, really old system. And before I even started to look at it, someone said, go talk to the users first, and then I'll show it to you. I said, okay. So I walked around, I found a couple reporters in this content management system, and I said, hey, what do you think of this tool? And verbatim, someone said, it is the worst part of my day. It's like, wow, okay, maybe you're just being a little hyperbolic there. No, seriously. It's the worst part of my day. And I thought to myself, I said, explain to myself why. I went back to my team, I was like, okay, show me this tool. And they put it in front of me, they opened it, and it took 42 seconds to boot up. 42. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I'm not gonna count to 42. But imagine that times 10. And every day, your job requires you to use this tool, and you have to wait 42 seconds for it to work. So I went back to my team, I said, why? What happened? Why? And they said, neglect. Because when you set up your OKRs and you set up your roadmap, you're trying to deliver on this business-facing, this consumer-facing goal. In our case, it was page impressions and ad revenue. And we couldn't prioritize our product because it didn't ladder up to that business-facing objective. So instead, it just sat and got older and harder to use until the point that they had to hire me and a few other members of our team to totally redo it from scratch. That is an insane investment in both people, time, energy that could have been saved if they thought about incorporating killing as part of the process during the extent of the development. So when we talk about our process, where a lot of focus is on making sure we deliver on that user promise, but I would say if you're not killing often, you're not delivering on that user promise, because at some point, all of this is going to build up and you will have to stop any progress on your roadmap to fix the issues. Now let's look more on that. If you are not doing this, all of this is anti-user. If you're leaning into your emotion more than anything else, you're building products for you. Congratulations, you're a use case of one. You have built yourself a product, but that may not actually reflect the user needs. Failure is taboo. If you're not being honest about the things that are working, you're creating this false narrative about how you're contributing to your product. And lastly, if you're not being honest about the pitfalls in your process, then you are contributing bloat. You're just shoving stuff in there, and that's going to affect speeds, health, performance, because all of that new stuff feels shinier and more interesting than the existing that you are supposed to be taking care of. So with all of that, that leads us to how important killing is. And this is really the thesis of today. If killing products is, you can justify this in many different ways on why to keep it. But ultimately, you're trying to free yourself from the burden of maintaining something that is not working. And if you can do this regularly, that to me is the healthiest sign of a product team, where you can be evaluating your existing set, saying what works, based on the metrics you set, what doesn't, and actually respond to that. Now, I personally do like calling it killing because I have a flair for the dramatics, but you can call it anything you want. You can do it deprecating, you can call it sunsetting, you can call it unshipping, whatever's most palatable for you and your teams. But ultimately, the concept is the same, where killing is ultimately perceived as a manifestation of failure. People don't like to kill things because then it wasn't good enough in the beginning. But if you don't do this over time, you are holding back your users to what was once perceived as the value to deliver. You're not giving your space to change, to adapt to new user needs, and you're not maintaining the health of both your teams and your product. And listen, you're in good company. We are not alone in this. And you can see on the spectrum on the bottom, this goes from small feature sets like we had at Instagram when they hid the likes numbers on their posts. They did that as a direct relation to a user behavior that they found to be unsavory, this idea that people were posting more for the likes than they were for social good, basically. And in the middle, so you can see this as a full feature on Twitter Fleets. Did anyone use Fleets? Quick show of hands. Yeah, exactly. What happened was that Twitter thought that they needed another way to increase retention and engagement on platforms. So they created a Instagram Stories-like feature for Twitter. 8 months, they realized that was not working, and they killed it. And then totally on the opposite side of the spectrum, where we have these full product offerings, my former team, they built out what was CNN Plus. It's supposed to be a streaming service focused on news, original programming, talk shows, that kind of thing. And then we were acquired by a different company who had a different strategic vision on what, number one, the streaming industry looks like, and two, the power of news as part of your entertainment diet. So 30 days after CNN Plus launched, it was gone. And it depends on how you perceive this. One other great example, Google. Google was started in 1998. They have killed 267 projects since. That averages about 11 a year, because they have a very judicious way of looking at success. They have very specific measurements they look at, and if it works, great. If not, kill it. It's not emotions, it's math at that point. And when you put this all together, it all has the same question you need to ask yourself, and that's around risk or reward. Does the return on investment of the effort, the people, the time, the money, everything else that goes into this, does it match, one, your strategic vision? And this is really challenging, especially if your leadership does not have a strong strategic vision, because we will be working towards something and then people change it. And you're like, well, what happened? So if there is a strong strategic vision, it's very easy to see how your product ladders up to that. If you don't, it's going to be really challenging. That ambiguity is really challenging to work in. Number two, the user needs. This is obvious. This is why we're here. Users have problems, we solve them. If your product does not solve that user need that you're after, that you think will correlate to some business objective, whether it's scale, growth, retention, maybe pause and say, why are we doing this right now? Product health and performance, something that people don't often pay attention to, but it's table stakes. We're talking about load times. We're talking about heft of the product. That all contributes to the user experience, because if the thing doesn't load, how are people going to use it? And lastly, our value prop. Are we working on things that are absolutely essential, the basic expectations of our product? Or are we adding things that are novelty, that will be there for, I don't know, a couple months before engagement drops off? Is that the right use of our time? And if the answer is no to any of these, that's okay. Get rid of it. More questions to ask yourself. And you're in this position, you're going to take this with your teams. It can be uncomfortable, because these are poignant issues to raise, and people will have differing opinions on the value of all of this. In this list, and this is certainly not comprehensive, I particularly like these 4. Is the cost of maintenance proportional to usage? So maintenance can be defined in many different ways. Where we can talk about cost, we could talk about the team that is intended to maintain that. If the cost of maintenance is not equal to usage, kill it. If it is promoting the wrong user behavior, they're using an old version of your platform, it encourages weird interactions between users, whatever it is, if it's encouraging the wrong user behavior, you kill it, right? If this is stopping you from doing something else because it's taking so much time and energy to maintain this thing, and you can't actually focus on whatever is next, you kill it. See the pattern here? If you can't defend this decision to your executives of why this team needs to be working on this right now, what do? Ah, vous êtes très intelligent. Merci. So, the longer we wait, the harder it becomes to deprecate. Because processes are built around this thing. Workflows are built around this thing. It becomes more critical to the day-to-day of somebody the longer you wait. Because things are built on top of, and then that untangling is costly. It's expensive. It takes a long time. So as soon as you see something that is not working for you, the data is going down month over month. The user is no longer your target persona. Whatever it is, start thinking about killing. Because here's your product development lifecycle, and this is what everything goes through. You can say that it doesn't, but let's not be naive about this. Everything goes through the start phase, right? And at that point, you're testing a lot of different things, seeing what sticks, and whatever doesn't stick, get rid of. Because whatever does is going to propel you to that growth stage. When you're in that growth stage, you might be pivoting on a couple different ideas, things that showed potential in the beginning that you want to maintain. For the things that don't pivot well, as you get into that maturity stage, you kill what's left behind. Again, going back to the beginning, 20% of your features are going to lead to 80% of engagement, so that other stuff in between, there's no value in it. Get it off your plate so you can focus on the things that are delivering value. And when it gets into decline, that's where you kill off the things that you see month over month decreases in to make room to match the user behavior that you're seeing in the product that day. And this leads you to the prioritization of this, and that's really where it gets tricky. So part of this is an exercise in prioritization. The more that you can have this as part of those conversations, the more valuable and ingrained in the process it becomes. No matter which way you use prioritization methods, this can work. I'm going to show you two. For example, does anyone use the Kano model? Anyone see this one before? A couple head nods. This is a concept. Nope, there you go. This is a concept where you have three areas: basic expectations, which are the most basic things that you expect people to do, the critical path that gets you there. Then you have your satisfiers, the things that you think are nice, that add a little bit of differentiation. And then you have your delighters, the things that are really extra special that really back up your value prop. Take it, reverse it. You get the reverse Kano. Now, if you're thinking about this as part of your deprecation prioritization, basic expectations do wane over time because your user changes. And those things that maybe were satisfiers at some point might become displeasures. You don't really hate them, but they're kind of annoying. It's an extra step for you to do. And the last thing is offenders, things that really stop you from doing whatever you're trying to do. So if you take that basic expectation from the initial version and you flip it, you're in a pretty good spot. 2x2 matrix. So the most common 2x2 matrix that we have is value versus effort. People tend to use that one to map out prioritization, and that sweet spot is that top right. If you're doing this from a deprecation standpoint, you change your axis on the matrix. Maintenance versus usage, cost versus usage, differentiator versus core value prop, user sentiment versus cost to maintain. Whatever the things that are important for you to define as part of your deprecation process can go on here. And as you're going through prioritization and you have a moment that you can look at the existing feature sets that you have, put them on here with this idea that every time you add something new, you're going to want to take something out. Another good way to think about this. So at this point, you've made the really brave decision to deprecate something. Congratulations, you're in good company. What do you do then? Well, there's a 3-step process that I'm going to call the RIPPP that will walk you through the things you need to do once you decide to kill something. First thing is perspective. There's 2 things to think about. One is to orient around new opportunities by killing off something that gives you space to do something new. You have green space ahead of you. What are you going to do with that? You can allocate resources for better projects. You can eliminate dependencies. You can bring joy in some way, shape, or form, which is great. On the same point of perspective, you also then have to admit risks, and timing in particular, since people are very cautious about getting rid of something because it does take time. So here you admit how long it might take. Prepare your CX team with some sort of response if people reply. Benchmark potential differences in metrics over time so you can be aware of what these changes might mean. And again, what you're looking for is, in the positive way, internally, you're looking at decreased bugs. You're looking at faster load times. You're looking at faster development cycles because you no longer have to go through the mud of several systems in order to release something. On the external front, there's user sentiment you're hoping to see. Certainly retention are my favorite. Maybe this opens the opportunity for a community or underserved group that previously were unable to use your product because they lived in a place without high-speed Wi-Fi and they couldn't load it, these kinds of things. So what is the opportunity and the things to keep in mind when you're in this perspective point? Second, planning. How are you actually going to do this? Well, I work in large-scale direct-to-consumer organizations. I have a lot of users. So I personally favor the cold turkey approach. Just kill it. What's going to happen? Well, don't answer that. If it's a really big feature, I'll keep an eye on some data, but ultimately, I have gone through this process. I've understood why it's important to deprecate. I'm going to move forward with that. If you are a little bit more risk adverse, perhaps you go into the wean mentality, this idea that you remove this feature for 10% of users and measure what happens. Can you correlate any either positive or negative behaviors to that removal? And third, this idea of advance notice, which is in more B2B kind of a relationships, this idea of telling someone in advance that a system or a feature or functionality is going to be deprecated. You tell them the impact that that means for them as a team, and you guide them through that transition process. And the last thing here is around peace. If you made this decision, go with it. Take note, take solace in the fact that you did something very healthy for your product. Your team will thank you. And really what you have to do is document what happened. Keep it real. There's supporting artifacts here. You made this decision for a reason. Let people know why. Circulate the learnings. People may eventually make the same mistake you did, but take a second and say, this is why you were doing this. And ultimately, use your OKRs, that business objective, as your guiding light. Explain why your product was no longer serving that need and what you're doing now with the time and space and resources that you just let up from the previous product that you just deprecated. And talk about why it's important to now be critical about the user needs, be really bullish about delivering that, and again, bring more joy. So, with that, you have all sat through a very long day of very exciting product presentations. So I created a very handy one-slider that basically takes everything I just talked about in a single slide. Number one, remove emotion. It's not personal, it's business. You are here to deliver on your user value. Make sure that is your guiding light when you're making decisions. Number two, as you add, audit. Every time you say, hey, I'm going to bring something to the table, see if there's something you can take back. And best case scenario, include that work as part of scope so it doesn't actually add to your backlog or your velocity from a team perspective. Number three, normalize the process. The more that you can talk about killing as part of your regular process, the less taboo it will become. People will see it as fun and freeing and a moment for you to actually refocus on the things you're supposed to be doing. And number four, reflect and document. Thank the product for its service. Acknowledge how much fun you had while it was live, and send it off to green pastures in a meaningful way to give yourself space to continue product development. And with that, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Stephanie. So we have a few questions.
Okay.
For you. The first one is, how do you differentiate between the products that you need to skill and a product that is a bit old and you just need to revamp?
Yeah, there is no difference. Products can be old or new and you can kill them. Products can be old or new that just need a little bit of TLC. Ultimately, what I try to look at is if you see one thing that's user behavior gone wrong, things that are not incorporated as part of your value prop, or alternatively, you look at the data. If you see month-over-month regression, if you see that something is taking an unproportional amount of your time but is not actually delivering those results, all of those are candidates to kill. And every time you do kill something, you can still think, what's the user problem I'm trying to solve? And either revamp parts of the functionality, it doesn't have to be a full outward slaughter, but parts of it to see if you can encourage the right behaviors, or take a minute with your team and think about whether or not there's a better way to deliver on that promise. So it doesn't have to be a full 0 to 100 killing, but it is a good idea for you to remove pieces of it, see what sticks as part of that delivery, and then reevaluate whether or not that is affecting the problem that you have identified.
You talk about emotions of the product managers, like killing their babies. What about emotions of the rest of the team, developers, designers? How do you handle it?
Sure. Interesting that you said developers. Designers, for sure, I can understand. I've never worked with a developer that had a particular affinity for what they're working on, actually. For designers in particular, there's a lot of effort that's put into developing the right kind of flows, right? But we all are still here for a very specific purpose, and that purpose is to solve the user need. So you can still come up with your best case scenario, and then you can go into something like an A/B testing flow or any of these validation techniques. You can put it in front of user testing. You can prototype something. And if it's still not answering the bill, at least then you have evidence to say, as much as you love this idea, as much as you love this concept, it's still not going to work. And that goes back to this idea that we have to remove emotion from the conversation. Because we're not answering for ourselves, we're answering for our users.
One more question. How do you convince top management to invest in killing a product?
Show them how much money they're wasting. For these products, especially when they're old, are cost monsters. And when you do something like look at the evaluation of why it's important to remove and the benefit of new, it's very easy to say how much money has gone to something that is a bad user experience. When I was working on that content management system, that 42 seconds, we needed budget to replace it. So we went to a board meeting and we just opened it and we let it sit for 42 seconds and had people feel how uncomfortable that was. Whatever's the best story you need to tell, but ultimately, how can you justify to executives the amount of money and time and effort is spending on something that actually it sucks, it feels bad, it's not doing anything for your users. So putting together that compelling narrative can be challenging. If you have executives that are data-driven, then you have things like hard numbers. If they're more qualitative, you can get testimonials of people who have to use your product. But that together puts together a really compelling case of why something needs to be deprecated.
Thank you, Stephanie.
Thank you.